Hello and good afternoon. I'm Karen Wolf. I'm the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the JCB's staff and board, to welcome you both to Brown's beautiful campus and to, I was going to say beautiful Providence. It is beautiful. It is also hot and sticky Providence, but it'll be better tomorrow, honest. And it's still beautiful. It's just a little warmer than we're used to, I guess. So we're so delighted to be partnering with the Maneul Center and with UPenn's Kislak Center on this exciting conference, Archives of Revolution. This conference is part of the JCB's three-theme focus for 2026 and beyond. We're developing programs and events around, number one, foundations of historical knowledge, the role of libraries and archives in what we know about the past, and especially, of course, this vast revolutionary period. Two, foundations of revolution, the expansive period of revolution across the Atlantic, but especially in this hemisphere. One feature of that work will include a conference on the Haitian Revolution next June in partnership with the Ruth Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice here at Brown. Please keep an eye out for that call for papers and more program information. And third, foundations of democracy, with an emphasis on freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. This is a very Rhode Island focus, of course, but of course also extends across the early Americas, and we're excited to have developed some meaningful programs and partnerships that we'll be sharing soon. All three of these themes are deeply meaningful to us at the JCB, and we feel deeply consistent with our traditions of supporting scholarship and inquiry for community and public, for the community and public good. And after what I have apparently written in my comments here as generically welcoming comments, I am now going to turn to some comments. First, me, and then my wonderful and esteemed co-chairs, Emma Hart, Director of the Maneul Center for Early American Studies, and Sean Quimby, Director of the Kislak Center at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, have prepared to kick us off on Archives of Revolution. So, perhaps obviously, the arrival in just 2 short years of the 250th anniversary of American independence offers so much opportunity for us to engage big questions in the service of the public good about the full and complex histories of the 18th century, and to the point of this conference, about the nature of the materials that can help inform those histories. Many of us here have been hard at work on creating more access to history and more access to the materials that make it. And it's going to be very exciting for us to discuss so many dimensions of this question about archives and how we know what we know about the past over the coming days. But we are clearly working in a long-standing, in fact, centuries-long tradition of seeing access to more primary archival and library materials as a form of service to commemoration and most directly to the nation. In the bicentennial of 1976, of course, a context that is always going to inform what we do, both because some of us experienced it, but also because it occurred in a moment of revival of social history and a more expansive view of early America. This was a moment that has carried us into this one. The bicentennial prompted the funding and production of documentary editions and of scholarly monographs. I am remembering in particular the series of conferences and then volumes of essays created under the auspices of the Capitol Historical Society, but funded directly by Congress via a wily legislator. Edited by my predecessor at my previous job, the historian Ron Hoffman, in conjunction with some of the greats of his generation, including Ira Berlin. These volumes included one about women in the American Revolution, religion in the American Revolution, diplomacy in the American Revolution, you're getting the idea, and slavery and freedom in the Age of Revolution. There were more than 10 volumes in all, and they included work of the most advanced scholarship, and they meant to stand as a gift to the nation of the kinds of historical work that it would inform the following generations, and I think they did. But an even more long-standing tradition and commitment to source materials garnered more funding during the bicentennial and an incredible legacy. Beginning in the 1960s, public and private entities were investing in documentary editing, seeing the transcription and publication of particular types of materials as an essential part of how we get to grips with the history of revolution. July 4th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy wrote the following, quote, "Primary sources constitute the backbone of written history, and history is the means by which a nation repossesses its past. As the bicentennial of our own Declaration of Independence draws near, it is all the more important to publish as completely as possible the original papers essential to a full understanding of our nation. This was written as a foreword to the first of what would be a dozen and ongoing volumes of the naval documents of the American Revolution, published by the Department of the Navy. I think we can agree that in addition to Kennedy's remarkable prescience about the coming of the bicentennial, 13 years in advance, he was like, it's drawing near, right? And here we are, 2026 is right around the corner. For the 250th, the semi-quincentennial, we have an opportunity to ask an entirely new set of questions of and about archives and primary sources. And with that, I will hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Hart.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. And of course, I also want to say thank you to the JCB, to the amazing events team at Brown University for partnering with us on this and for hosting it and for doing essentially all of the legwork that has got all of you wonderful people into this gorgeous room today for what I'm sure is going to be an amazing event. I just wanted to offer a few remarks about where the thinking for this conference came from. It's very much something I would say that Karen and Sean and I have cooked up together. It really is a joint project from the beginning. And for me, it comes from thinking about how we know what we know about the past, and using that as a potential and very fruitful lens for thinking about the 250th, something that is perhaps slightly different than talking about the historiography of the revolution, thinking more about what archives are. And it comes from, my sort of potted historical knowledge of what archives are. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that chronology to get us thinking about how we can contribute to this question of how we know what we know about the past and how we can change the frameworks for thinking about it. So as far as I can see it, I think there are three processes across the centuries when it comes to the Revolutionary Archive. So we can trace, for example, collecting from individual dilettantes through the institutions that they then established to house their collections, and now through recent processes of digitizing these collections, and also, of course, curating them in the form that Karen was starting to talk about. My first encounter with some of these dilettantes was the wonderful, quirky loner that is Swiss emigre Eugène de la Cimetière, whose papers are in the Library Company in Philadelphia, and of course I've had lots of opportunity to look at those since I moved there. And they're going to be the core of an exhibition at the Library Company in 2026, which I think is indicative of how such collections still endure as coherent sort of documentary foundations for interpreting the revolution. So this, of course, this individual collecting became more institutionalized in the 19th century and the 20th century, with gentlemen collectors like Jeremy Belknap, Peter Force, who we're going to hear about at this conference, and Jared Sparks, curating larger quantities of revolutionary materials and establishing institutional archives like the Massachusetts Historical Society and the American Antiquarian Society. And of course, then in the 20th century, printed collections of documents curated by eminent historians or an emerging professional class of historians like Franklin Jameson and Henry Steele Commager became popular. And in fact, I'm old enough to remember sitting down with Commager's collection of American historical documents in my college library when I was an undergraduate. That was at Oxford, so of course it was a bit behind the curve as usual. This wasn't quite as long ago as you might have imagined. But then, of course, this publication of documentary collections exploded with sponsorship of people like Kennedy in 1976, and these documentary editing projects of Founding Fathers papers are still ongoing. But then, of course, we have the internet, which has changed all of this. We have multiple projects that have sought to increase access to these archives, something that, of course, has been more or less successful depending on what side of the paywall you're on in many cases, whether you're at a wealthy institution or a less wealthy institution. I've been at both in the last 20 years, so I've been on both sides of it. So I think some of the themes that come through here are individual gentlemen of a certain class. There's a certain level of exclusivity and privilege and access, I think, which I hope are going to become guiding questions as we interrogate this archival trajectory over the next couple of days. I think as we interrogate the foundations of the Revolutionary Archive, I hope that we can start to think about what it has been and what it can be in the future. Of course, since I'm a historian, I'm never going to advocate jettisoning what we've built, but I think it can be really fruitful to be more conscious about its character and think about what comes next in our digital world that seems so full of possibilities, perhaps to an even slightly overwhelming extent. So this obviously is a massive task, not something that we're going to accomplish in the next couple of days, but that's okay, because we're just at the beginning of decades of revolutionary anniversaries. we've got at least 11 years to contemplate this. And in fact, this is another reason why I wanted to commit the Maneul Center to something like this that could go on in perhaps a more exciting and fruitful way than a conference in which we discuss thinking about the revolution, sort of a standalone conference. So I'm really happy that you're all here to be part of the beginning of this conversation. We are going to be turning this conference into a special issue of Early American Studies. We're hoping to have an innovative format in which each panel is a sort of short set of pieces together focusing on a theme. So we're really pleased that you're here at the conception of this project, which we hope will go on to take a life of its own on over the next decade or so. So I haven't been too ambitious or anything, or committed my colleagues here to anything at all. And with that, I'll hand over to Sean, who's going to have the final word.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Karen, and thanks to our participants. My task is to say a few words about the importance of bringing archivists and historians together around this conversation. It could be argued that the archive was born of revolution, specifically the French one, when in 1794, 5 years after the storming of the Bastille, the First Republic issued a decree requiring that historical records and those being generated by the fledgling government be brought together by the state. It would take roughly a century, however, for the professional archivist to emerge, and for much of the 19th century, when the first archives of the American Revolution were being defined, as Emma has pointed out, archivists identified as historians and vice versa. That changed in the early 20th century as archivists professionalized, becoming practitioners of archival science, as it were. And later in the century, humanists began to use the word archive in ways that at times could be absolutely befuddling to actual archivists. More recently, and fortuitously, the two communities seem to be talking to each other again, often in digital spaces and increasingly in physical ones like this conference. 2026 represents an opportunity for us to show what we have learned from these renewed conversations, to reflect on the Revolutionary Archive, how it was conceived in the past, and how we might conceive of it today. In the course of our work at Penn, as part of the Revolutionary City Collaborative, it's a group of Philadelphia institutions that takes its name from the web portal devised and hosted by the American Philosophical Society. We conducted focus groups with diverse and mostly urban audiences, asking them what they want out of America 250. I was reviewing that last night, and and was reminded that we learned three things. First, that there is a real appetite for lesser-known narratives of the revolution. Second, that audiences want to hear about the Black experience beyond slavery. And finally, that they want to be able to draw comparisons between then and now. So it seems to me that the archive is where it all begins, where the work of collecting, cataloging, and digitizing can't really be separated from the work of interpreting and contextualizing. By talking to one another, we will become better, more self-aware archivists and historians, and we will be able to give our fellow citizens what they tell us they're hungering for. Thank you.
So I have to just note that as Emma and Sean and I were talking about this project, we also wrote a piece for a blog called Age of Revs called Archives of Revolution. And we mapped out some of these thoughts ahead of time, and I feel like we're going to be returning to that. And my first thought, as Emma was saying, all the things we're going to do beyond this was we have to go rewrite another blog post. Anyway, I am so sorry to say that my colleague Tony Bogues, great scholar of Haiti and director of the Ruth Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice here, could not be with us tonight as planned. Tony asked me to let you know that he really wishes he could be with us, but circumstances intervened, and he did want me to underscore our joint conference on Haiti planned for next June. So thank you for that, Tony. So it is, I think, incredibly appropriate that chairing our keynote this evening instead will be the JCB's Dr. Bertie Mandelblatt, George S. Parker, curator of maps and prints, a historical geographer with an expertise in the French Americas. So Bertie, Chris, Manuel.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Karen and Sean and Emma, for that wonderful introduction to the next few days. I'm delighted to be introducing the conference keynote presentation today and to be moderating the conversation that's going to happen afterwards. This keynote session by Professors Maneul Covo and Christopher Hodson features an exciting exploration of a previously unknown source, touching on some of the themes that Karen mentioned are at the heart of the JCB's thematic for 2026. The keynote underlines the importance of Haiti and the Haitian Revolution for world history, as well as for the themes of this conference, the foundations of historical knowledge, the foundations of revolution, and the foundations of democracy. The conference that we will host at the JCB next year is part of our longstanding interest in and support of research on the Haitian Revolution. And just this morning, in fact, speaking a little to the issues that Sean in particular raised, in fact, are really at the heart of this conference, I met with Chris and Manuel for an object session in which we looked at all of the items that JCB acquired in the last financial year that are connected to Haiti and the colony of Saint-Domingue that preceded the foundations of the Republic of Haiti. And they were substantial. What particularly struck me was the range of formats: printed books and pamphlets, manuscript and printed maps, engraved portraits, and even 2 watercolor paintings. This range in formats points to the complexity of knowledge production and of the kind of research needed to draw together meaning across formats and across collections, exactly the kind of research that Chris and Manuel will now be presenting on. We are very lucky to hear them today present work from their upcoming book project that will be published by the Omohundro Institute with a paper entitled The Treasurer's Tale, A Lost Account of War, White Supremacy, and Black Radicalism in the Haitian Revolution. So just a bit of an intro to both of our speakers. Maneul Covo is an associate professor in the history department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Maneul has published widely and for many years on French Empire and the Atlantic world in the long 18th century, with a focus on political economy and revolution, including many articles and book chapters, such as recent articles in French historical studies and the Annales historiques de la Révolution française, and a chapter in Patrick Boucheron's edited volume, L'Histoire mondiale de la France. He is perhaps best known for his recent award-winning monograph Entrepot of Revolutions, Saint-Domingue, Commercial Sovereignty, and the French-American Alliance, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Christopher Hodson is an associate professor in the history department at Brigham Young University. Chris has also published widely on European empire in the Americas in the early modern period, and he is also an expert specifically of the French Empire, publishing articles and book chapters in such publications as the William and Mary Quarterly, French Historical Studies, and Early American Studies. He is author of the 2012 monograph, The Acadian Diaspora, an 18th Century History, published by OUP, Oxford University Press, and with Brett Rushforth, he is the co-author of an upcoming book to be published by the Omohundro Institute on the intertwined histories of France, West Africa, and the Americas, from the medieval period through the Age of Revolutions. So with that, I ask you to join me in welcoming Chris and Maneul for their talk.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bertie. It's such a delight to be here. Let me begin by thanking our hosts. I was so delighted to be invited to this conference by Karen Wolf and Emma Hart, who I've known for a very long time and who are among the most generous and smart and humane leaders in academia I've ever encountered. And I'm so delighted to be able to get to know Sean Quimby and his institution a little bit more. Thank you to the organizers of the event, to Gianna and Megan, who made me write Empress on her business card, which I thought was a bold move, but in any case. And if I can start on a somewhat, if you'll allow me, a somewhat personal note, many, many years ago, when I, as a high school senior, started applying to universities, I only applied to 2. I'm from a small town in Utah, and I applied for reasons that made no sense in 1993 and don't make any more sense now, to the University of Utah and to Brown University. And man, I did not get into Brown University. So it is delightful to be back and speaking at this venue. In 1995, Michel-Rolph Trouillot published Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, a seminal work that not only transformed the field of Haitian revolutionary studies, but also had a profound impact on historiography as a whole. Trouillot argues that, quote, inequalities experienced by the actors lead to uneven historical power in the inscription of traces. He emphasizes that archives can silence voices and in this sense act as instruments of domination. The Haitian Revolution, led by enslaved people and people of color, but long overlooked in the historiography of democratic revolutions, with a few notable exceptions, C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins served as a paradigmatic example of this phenomenon. Over the past 30 years, however, this history has been unsilenced, with scholarly publications on the Haitian Revolution multiplying to such an extent that it has become a key element within the mainstream scholarly narrative of the late 18th century Atlantic world. This effort has been accompanied by successful searches for new sources scattered across many countries, including France, the UK, Spain, the United States, Jamaica, Cuba, and Venezuela. Julia Gaffield's discovery of the only known original copy of the Haitian Declaration of Independence in the National Archives of the UK, for example. I'd be remiss, though, if I didn't mention that one really unique element of the Haitian Revolution and its historiography is the fact that the vast, vast majority of the relevant sources associated with that revolution are not kept in Haiti, unlike the American and French revolutions. And that in and of itself, of course, is an artifact of imperial power and race. As a result, Haitian researchers themselves have had a tremendously difficult time accessing those archival sources. There is, to be sure, a national Haitian historiography. However, it is a function of individual heroism rather than any systematic attempt to build it. Now, despite all of this, there is a wealth of sources that deal with the Haitian Revolution, including administrative archives, parliamentary records, pamphlets, treaties, private correspondence, and notarial documents. But to gain a more personal and intimate understanding of the experience of the Haitian Revolution, we primarily have narrative accounts penned by the, quote, unfortunate colonists. That is, planters who fled the colony to claim refugee status in the United States and France, while demanding financial compensation for their losses, including those in human property. As Ada Ferrer and others have noted, unlike the American and French revolutions, the Haitian Revolution's early histories and the creation of its archives were largely the work of the revolution's losers. It's worth noting that these losers lost like no losers before them had, and that their racialized attempts to account for that loss had a profound impact on the development of racist culture, thought, and policy, and on the production of history and on the organization of archives throughout the 19th century Atlantic world. What sources then can be used to rebalance this history, and how should they be analyzed? These questions are at the heart of the translation and publishing project that we have pursued, inspired by a discovery in the British Library of Révolution de Saint-Domingue, the first page of which you see up there, a 300-page unpublished manuscript written by a virtually unknown white man, Jacques Périès. Périès had arrived in Saint-Domingue early in 1800, nearly 9 years after the massive 1791 slave revolt that turned France's most important, profitable, and deadly colony upside down. Nearly 6 years after the French Republic, bowing to military necessity, and the successes of Saint-Domingue's black insurgency had abolished slavery, and mere months after Napoleon Bonaparte had seized power in France in the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire. Although he identifies himself as a treasurer on the manuscript's title page, Périès was in fact a jack of all trades in Saint-Domingue's colonial administration, fulfilling a variety of loosely defined roles such as tax collector and estate inspector. He was also a snitch. The reason we know anything about him other than this particular manuscript is that he spied on his friends and colleagues in Saint-Domingue's dead last French colonial administration, sending letters about their activities back to the Ministry of the Navy in France, and those letters exist in the Archives d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence, France. Additionally, Périès attempted to engage in private business ventures, hoping for a lucrative commercial breakthrough that never materialized. As he did all of these things, Périès witnessed the final phases of the Haitian Revolution, fleeing Saint-Domingue as the Napoleonic invasion of that colony was defeated by men and women of color associated with Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Christophe, and many others. He evacuated the colony sometime in late 1803 aboard the George and Ophelia, a British corsair that ferried him to Providence in the Bahamas, where he completed work on his long manuscript in the months after Haiti declared independence from France on January 1st, 1804. Now, just as a kind of side note, how did this manuscript get, of all places, to the British Library in London? All credit to my undergraduate research assistant, Emma Griffin, soon to be an NYU PhD student, who figured all of this out. The manuscript was sold to the British Library by a person named Richard Stanley Hawkes Moody, who was a military man of the British Empire. He's a veteran of the Anglo-Zulu War from 1879, the Second Boer War in 1899 to 1900. He is the person who sold this manuscript to the British Library. His father, and I'm speaking Karen Wolf's language here, talking about genealogy, his father had also been a colonial official. He was the founder and first lieutenant governor, for example, of British Columbia. He was also a governor of the Falkland Islands, and he served kind of crucially in St. Vincent in the Caribbean. His father, so the seller's grandfather, Thomas Moody, was a tremendously influential figure in the British Caribbean between 1797, basically in the 1820s. He served as an aide-de-camp of multiple post-Napoleonic British governors, from Tortola to Barbados. He was also part of a parliamentary commission that traveled around the British Caribbean trying to suss out violations of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. So best we can figure, that's how the manuscript got from place to place. It got from the Caribbean, it left the French intellectual circuits of the late 19th or late 18th century, entered the British Empire via its author's exile in the Bahamas, and made its way via Thomas Moody through this family into the British Library. And that passage of this manuscript is such a wonderful expression, and kind of terrible expression, of the realities that we're dealing with in this conference, how archives are produced and how race and empire and capitalism collude to produce the archives that we have. Reading this manuscript in the British Library had a deep impression on both Maneul and myself. Although Jacques Périez was himself something of a nobody, he was in frequent and direct contact with, among others, Toussaint Louverture, as well as Generals Leclerc and Rochambeau, the leaders of France's 1802 expedition to reassert metropolitan control and reinstate slavery in Saint-Domingue. In addition to his revealing personal connections, Périez also framed his manuscript as a historiographical intervention. In his introduction, he notes that, quote, "So many broadsides, newspapers, and memoirs, or rather libels, have made the first era of the revolution so well known that it is unnecessary to discuss them again." Périez thus situates his history within the revolution's second era, a period defined by Toussaint's attempts to construct a mostly autonomous colonial state and by the furious reaction of Napoleon's consular regime. We believe that publishing this text can make a significant contribution to various fields of research, study of the Haitian Revolution, the era of Atlantic revolutions, the history of colonial capitalism, and the history of race. As a result, we've embarked on a project to translate Périez's manuscript into English and publish a critical edition. But why? After all, the book was written by an unknown white figure who, in the end, supported and represented the colonizing metropolis. There are already accounts of the Haitian Revolution written by Marcus Rainsford, Descourtils, Pamphile de la Croix, Charles Malenfant. There are also the narratives of the, quote, unfortunate colonists who fled Saint-Domingue, recounting their own misfortunes, some of which have been published and translated by Jeremy Popkin. So on the surface, Jacques Périez and his manuscript do not offer a perspective that'll help unsilence or amplify the voices of Black or mixed-race revolutionaries, whether principal or subordinate actors or women. Périez is in fact precisely the type of person despised by the Baron de Vasté, the mixed-race Haitian intellectual whose early 19th century denunciation of France's colonial system has been brilliantly translated by Marlene Doubt. Périez is not one of the Haitian thinkers studied by historians such as Doubt, Didi Joseph, Chelsea Stieber, and others. And all of this raises two questions, which we'll try to answer today and which together align with one of the challenges of this symposium. Given what we know of Trouillot's archival inequalities, why publish and thereby amplify Périez's voice, and why translate it into English? What do we lose, but also what do we gain by doing so? On one level, although Périez belongs to the category of French white men, his manuscript presents a perspective distinct from the typical texts written by enslaving planters or military men. Instead, Périez and his text are representative of the multitude of petty officials, businessmen, and schemers who had swarmed Saint-Domingue since the 1760s. He was one of thousands of individuals who had hoped to profit from revolutionary possibilities and instabilities in one way or another during the tumultuous 1790s. So neither a planter nor a merchant nor a soldier, Périez was rather one of the small, ambitious, and often bitter civil servants who sometimes aligned with the planters' perspectives, sometimes with those of the colonial state, and sometimes with those of some version of the French republics or the Napoleonic consulates. The main purpose of Périez's manuscript is to denounce the French administration in Saint-Domingue, the real losers, per the author. Périez sarcastically exposes the, quote, irreparable faults of a government so frequently deceived that it appeared to desire nothing less. He targets the leaders, Generals Leclerc and Rochambeau, who were at the head of the massive expedition sent by Bonaparte in 1802. And Manuel, in just a second, will return to his far more ambiguous portrait of Toussaint Louverture himself. Périez criticizes Leclerc's blindness and foolishness, and he describes Rochambeau, infamous in Haitian historiography for his genocidal practices against peoples of color across Saint-Domingue, as one, but not the only, villain of his tale. Périez's depiction of Rochambeau is typical of his acerbic prose, highlighting the arbitrary power exercised in Saint-Domingue and denouncing the immorality and vices of a character dominated by lust and greed. And here is some of that text. And again, this is describing Rochambeau. Without scruples, absorbed by immorality and dominated by vicious women who knew nothing of administration, there was more brutality and anger than firmness on the military side. Brave during outbursts, but cowardly whenever convenient, badly advised, blushing at the sight of an honest man, careless out of laziness, and even by character, capricious and disorderly, caressing with one hand, killing with the other. Rochambeau, in a word, has more than demonstrated the first consul's error in naming him the colony's governor, and in giving him powers so extensive as to enable him to lose everything. He even defied the first consul more than once, briskly dismissing officials and claiming the right to replace them with people no more virtuous than him, but who would second him more effectively. Beyond these numerous critical portraits, Perriez targets military officers guilty of strategic and tactical errors, incompetence, corruption, and arbitrariness. More broadly, he condemns big government, the proliferation of military and state officials. To convey the image of an ever-expanding colonial state, Perriez frequently employs enumeration, his preferred rhetorical advice. And here again is some of his more machine-gunny prose. There were enterprising and undisciplined military officers, prefects without powers due to the perpetual state of war, sub-prefects who, like the ministers, had established offices of all colors, inspectors general and inspectors particular, along with their men, verifiers, controllers, stewards, commissioners of all classes, kinds, and ranks, quartermasters from all sides who sold to turn a profit, countless untalented health officers wearing embroideries and plumes and bearing dreadful swords, independent administrateurs de domaine acting on their own, and in the end, and for good reason, an inescapable chaos, a horrible profligacy, and a total loss of morals. Perriez here illustrates the accumulation of various administrative layers resulting from the different phases of the French Revolution. This period is characterized by the continual change of governments: monarchy, constitutional monarchy, republic, within the republic, Girondin and Jacobin republic, directory, consulate, and the intermittent arrival in Saint-Domingue of new state representatives and civil servants whose roles and responsibilities were often ambiguous and intertwined. Ironically, then, Perriez himself emerges as a product of the institutional confusion and administrative chaos, struggling to find his own place within it and raging at French officials who block his path. By contrast, Perriez tends to praise the virtuous planter, a resident who cultivates the land and suffers as a double victim at the hands of metropolitan abolitionists on the one hand and an inept colonial government on the other. Through his portrait of these planters, Perriez presents himself as an honest man, exposing the vices and intrigues of his and their business-minded enemies. The story's antagonist is not so much the famous Rochambeau as Toussaint Louverture's primary white advisor, a tremendously obscure person named Joseph Idlinger, who is a sketchy businessman from Bordeaux. Perriez describes him this way, quote, "This glowworm only appears bright in relation to the darkness that surrounds him," which on the one hand is an incredible diss. On the other, it's awfully difficult not to read in racial terms, given the context. We also discovered a document in the archive showing that Idlinger had rejected Perriez's application for a potentially lucrative administrative position. The enmity clearly had a personal dimension. Ultimately, Perriez himself resembled those he condemned, a product of the history of a French colonial state at once proliferating and disintegrating, and of the intertwining of business and government. The manuscript thus provides insight into the lesser-known figures spawned by the collision of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. Perriez's discussion of Haitian leaders, the revolutionary masses in Saint-Domingue, and the armées indigènes, that is, the armies of people of color, is notably less uniform compared to his treatment of the chief generals of metropolitan France. His narrative does begin with the typical racist cliches of the late 18th century. Of the French Republicans who abolished slavery in 1794, he wonders, quote, "And did we comprehend the peril of suddenly declaring an emancipation of so many individuals, lacking principles, morals, or social bonds, a populace steeped in betrayal, deceit, theft, poison, arson, and murder, and unfortunately only restrained by the threat of punishment?" Laziness and savagery are recurring themes in his writing. However, his account swiftly challenges this singular narrative, revealing a genuine admiration for the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. There's a second part.
So it's the continuation of the paper. So thank you. I'm very happy to be here as well, and thank you for this. So his assessment of Toussaint Louverture was ambivalent. Like many US newspapers in that time period, Révolution de Saint-Domingue depicts Toussaint as a great man. He was endowed with, quote, an uncommon memory, an ardent desire to educate himself, a limitless ambition, an inflexible but reasoned firmness, and a facility with ideas, and could have been the salvation of the colony. However, Toussaint Louverture was actually deceived by the informal government of white intriguers. In essence, Périès applies the trope of the misguided leader, akin to the accusation of ministerial despotism that was very common in France at that time. So although Christophe and Dessalines are depicted as exceedingly cruel, they are not, in Périès' view, devoid of merit. And certain black generals, like General Laplume, are portrayed in exclusively favorable terms. His virtues stand in stark contrast to the mediocrity of his white counterparts. Quote, all of Laplume's actions argue in his favor. His conduct and principles must be regarded as a devastating critic of those of many of our French generals. There were many who dared to suggest they abandoned the cause, notably whites who tried to frighten him, but he always carried himself with courage and devotion to the interests of France. Furthermore, those Périès labels as the Congos are shown to be more trustworthy in fulfilling their agreements with the white generals, particularly in supplying them with coffee beans, whereas the generals themselves betrayed this trust. In fact, racist undertones accompany these compliments. However, on one hand, these remarks bring certain individuals out of obscurity, while on the other, they suggest the ambivalence and judgments made about these men during a time of great confusion. The narrative also recounts the atrocities committed during the war. Christophe is accused of throwing his enemies into a well before burning them alive. Yet, the brutal acts committed by the white generals are not overlooked. Quite the contrary. Of particular note is the contemporary expression used to describe the drowning of prisoners that he described as the fish for corral. Quote, in the midst of these arbitrary and illegal executions, many blacks, mulattoes, and especially owners were daily sent to fish for corral, la pêche de corail, the expression used to refer to drownings, after which their belongings and commodities were immediately confiscated by the general. Seeing themselves destroyed and their property seized without cause, the mulattoes believed themselves obliged to raise the banner of revolt, which for them represented only vengeance. And Périès denounces the lesser-known subordinates responsible for this atrocity, such as the port captain named Gariscon. As a public treasurer, a tax collector, and an estate inspector, Périès possessed a sharp eye for figures, and the manuscript frequently discusses money, often referring them to millions, and his perspective reflects the essence of colonial political economy and echoes how ministries, merchants, and planters discussed Saint-Domingue during that era. Jean Dejean has recently highlighted the emergence of the term capitalist at the end of the 18th century in relation to the Haitian Revolution. The word was really spread in connection with Saint-Domingue in the French context. And this theme is clearly echoed in this manuscript. Révolution de Saint-Domingue lies at the intersection of the American, the French, and the Haitian Revolution. And Périès interprets the developments of the Haitian Revolution through metropolitan political categories, invoking figures of the terror, of the French terror, as repulsive symbols. The Jacobin of 1804, he writes, may be even more dangerous than that of 1793. Accustomed to drinking nothing but blood, his thirst remains unquenched. Périès' critique was typical of a later phase of the French Revolutionary period, the post-Thermidor era marked by the bourgeois republican ideal of the French Directory. Events in Saint-Domingue are portrayed as emblematic of the Republic's moral decay and the military's usurpation of power, albeit with subdued criticism of Napoleon Bonaparte. So it's also a pamphlet that's destined to the French context at that time. Amidst unrestrained Jacobinism and the arbitrary imposition of martial law, Périès aligns himself with the agrarian republicanism reminiscent of Jefferson's presidency. This condemnation is conveyed not only through these thematic deployments, but also through Perrier's deeply ironic and sarcastic style. So Perrier's style is political and has a specific meaning in the time period. So this is one example of his really vitriolic approach of writing. Quote, seeing no brigands against whom our young soldiers could exercise their courage, Jouet, Lavalette's aide de camp, encountered a pig in his wanderings. Filled with the righteous anger, he dispatched him with a stroke of his saber, thus meriting a sword of honor. That would have been the only blood shed, had a young officer, while trying to steal a parakeet, not been beaten until the blood flowed. Vengeance was only natural, the parakeet was killed, and the soldier given a promotion. So irony, satire, and sarcasm serve as antidotes to revolutionary grandiloquence and Bonapartist grandiloquence, pompousness, embodying the mocking spirit typical of the Thermidorian moment. However, this manuscript does not merely echo Perrier's voice. It is fundamentally polyphonic for several reasons. Firstly, Perrier positions himself as a contemporary historian, supporting his argument with a plethora of archival documents and other sources, such as newspapers and pamphlets, which he extensively quotes. And in the second part of the manuscript, these documents take precedence while Perrier assumes a more subdued role. So readers encounter proclamations, decree, and correspondence from figures like Leclerc, Rochambeau, Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, and Christophe. So you have examples here on the image of the kind of documents that were copied and inscribed within the manuscript. Additionally, Perrier frequently exposes the falsehoods of public discourse, positioning himself as a guardian of historical truth against the official narratives of those in power. Quote, it would be endless to recount all the absolutely false, perfidious stories that were fabricated and sent to France, he writes. He also derides these, quote, leader authors, these creators of magnificent reports. Moreover, he explains that the military intentionally destroyed documents that never reached archival depositories. In this regard, Révolution de Saint-Domingue can also be interpreted as a critical analysis of the construction of an official narrative, albeit not the one Trouillot envisioned, obviously, yet one that paves a way for historians to engage and hopefully students to reflect. Even more importantly, if we listen carefully, we'll hear the voices of actors who are often absent from the grand narratives, beyond just the leaders and colonists. Women in particular wielded significant influence in the Haitian Revolution. Perrier collectively attributes to them a role in the moral decay of the army, describing depraved white women whose lavish parties called bamboches left a lasting impact. But some women emerged as individuals of note. One such figure was Pauline Leclerc, sister of Napoleon Bonaparte and wife of the general-in-chief of the Saint-Domingue expedition. But Perrier also admires an influential Black woman, Marie Bunel, wife of the treasurer of Saint-Domingue, who led a diplomatic mission to the United States on behalf of Toussaint Louverture. Perrier explains that she rendered important service and, quote, was more valuable than her white husband. It's also worth reading Perrier's misogynistic discourse against the grain. For instance, in this passage, this Black woman named Cherinette, during the first revolt of the Blacks under Commissioner Sontonax Polverel and others, went around crying out for the slaughter and pillage of all the whites and designated the victims. Upon the arrival of General Rochambeau, who had known her in those days, she went to join him and placed herself under his protection. So beyond the accusations of immorality, we discern that Cherinette was a political actor who adeptly navigated new political landscapes while exerting genuine influence. But the text also hints at unnamed women who engaged politically and occasionally succeeded. Here, it becomes necessary to set Perriès' prejudices aside to acknowledge not just the resistance, but the leadership of the Black women. This is crucial as women are largely underrepresented in the historiography of the Haitian Revolution. There's literally so little work on that aspect. So this passage is partially evocative in that regard. So in this story, an old and rich inhabitant, Monsieur Couret, believed himself able to oblige a few scattered Negroes who belonged to him to come to his plantation. The men agreed to do so with no trouble and received from him the necessary aid. An impudent negress who lived with an officer of her color, however, refused. When her master told her that the law obliged her to return and take up the hoe and work as before, she protested to General Salm, who wrote to General Hardy, commander of the Northern Department. With no legal formalities and by his will alone, Hardy condemned the honest Monsieur Couret to be whipped by the executioner and to spend 6 hours in the stocks in the public plaza, with a sign on his chest bearing these words in bold writing: "I am condemned to 6 hours of pillory for telling the blacks that the law obliged them to go back to the plantations, there to be treated as they were before." So in this passage, the only named individuals are the white planters. So in Perriès' eyes, the victim, the honest Monsieur Couret, and the white general, who implemented the punishment the enslaved experienced on a regular basis before revolution. So, which is, according to Perriès, an utterly carnivalesque scene. The Black individuals remain unnamed, although the Black woman was the main actor in the story and demonstrated political savvy in her brave act of leadership. In her book, Dispossessed Enslaved Women, Violence and the Archives, Marisa Fuentes wrote, "History is produced from what the archive offers." The challenge is to write a history about what an archive does not offer. Here, Révolution Saint-Domingue does not offer a name, yet we get a glimpse of a Black woman's subjectivity and activism while confronting the violence of besieged white supremacy within the archive. Révolution Saint-Domingue should be seen as a layered source, a collage of multiple documents strung together, a series of interconnected narratives that extend beyond Perriès' own authority. And the endnotes are particularly noteworthy. In them, Perriès recounts personal conversations with Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines. The conversations serve as both evidence and validation, providing access to an oral tradition captured in the source, although subject to potential manipulations and distortions of memory. So, in this endnote, for instance, he described a conversation he had with Toussaint Louverture, so which would not make it to the main text, but so there's another narrative in the endnotes of the manuscript. Asked Toussaint one day why he, to whom the Constitution gave all power, deferred to France for military nominations. "I know my rights," he replied to me, "but I have my reasons. I do not want generals anymore. It suits me to have only removable commanders. Who unto the government whose leaders are constrained to elevate to superior ranks men with no goals other than to overthrow them and take their places. There should be a greater distance between them. This idea seemed to me to come from a place of great loneliness," says Perriès. So various regimes of discourse are articulated, presenting different truths and viewpoints, accompanied by the shadow of informants employed by Perriès, whites, mixed race, or blacks, unnamed individuals whose knowledge has been used, as Sarah Johnson observed in a recent monograph on Enlightenment thinker and planter, Moreau de Saint-Méry. It is plausible that Perriès occasionally misrepresents facts alongside factual error, which we endeavor to rectify in the footnotes, or in our own footnotes, the footnotes on the endnotes, in a sense. However, the major challenge to us, new to both of us, was the task of translating into English. And we would like to emphasize the pivotal role and significance of translation as a critical research tool in the analysis of archival production. The challenge extended beyond mere accessibility to an English-speaking audience. It required a deep understanding of every detail within the text, leaving no obscure passages unexamined. And certain highly technical terms, such as military jargon, were unfamiliar to us. At times, we encountered words that were unintelligible, like the echelon of the administrative hierarchy during the revolutionary period, which is extraordinarily complicated. Particularly challenging were racial designations. Should black be capitalized? Should the word négresse be translated? What kind of equivalent we're writing today, and how are we translating for today while acknowledging this is a source? In a sense, Révolution de Saint-Domingue also mirrors the role of the Haitian Revolution in Atlantic racial history at a time when Paris is grappling for new terms himself, and in constantly trying to capture changes in racial terminology. So there's no consistency in the use of the words, in his use of words. So translating the manuscript made that aspect more visible to us. As we discussed choices of words, and we had disagreements. Furthermore, we faced errors, erasures, and missing or illegible words. So that's a common issue in manuscripts. So as translators, these obstacles were constant companions throughout our work. So we adhere to the principle of never altering the archival content, though we did permit ourselves to add punctuation and transform lengthy sentences into shorter, more readable ones. So that's the decision we made. However, we were careful to preserve the idiosyncrasies of the original text, and you saw some of the idiosyncrasies already. So the close reading of the manuscript, imposed by the translation, also brought to light an intertextuality that initially eluded us. So several passages, in fact, draw from obscure La Fontaine's fable, like L'huître et les plaideurs, so a fable I had never heard of before, and include excerpts from Lully's opera, Armide. And these only appear to us in the process of translation. So translation has compelled us to make interpretive choices. Yet, we want to argue that this process does not detach us from the archival document. Rather, it adds to the historian's task of critically constructing the source, moving beyond the manuscript content or materiality. Here, Trouillot's approach resonates as we deconstruct and reconstruct the source, viewing it as a desacralized process aimed at providing substantiated evidence. This experiment, we hope, helps establish facts, but also eliminate distinct perspectives from a document whose unity remains problematic and assembled. Ultimately, we wish to emphasize that translation is also a research tool integral to historians' craft. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really compelling talk. You know what? I'm not going to make any comments because I think there are probably lots and lots of questions, and that's what I'm here to do, is moderate the discussion. So please wave your hand in the air if you've got questions.
Hi. Thanks. That was fascinating. It's amazing what one can find in archives where you don't expect to find them. I mean, who knew in the British National Archives that you would find something like this about the Haitian Revolution? And it raises so many fascinating questions. But one of the ones that I want to push you on has to do with some of the questions about democracy, actually, that Karen was raising at the beginning. And questions that also I've been working more generally on the British Empire in an earlier phase and other eras of others when there's martial law and what that means. To what extent really can we position this as something that's a democratic revolution, given this kind of evidence about authoritarian abuses?
Actually, why don't you guys go up there? I'm just, yeah. Oh, next. Thank you very much for that question. And it's slightly hard to hear up here. And so I did hear, there was sort of a question about to what extent we can sort of envision this manuscript as a function of the age of democratic revolutions and so forth. Was that part of the question?
My question was more, to what extent should we think about, what does this help us understand about the Haitian Revolution itself? Sure. And is this really democratic or more authoritarian? I mean, speaking as someone who's looked more earlier also at martial law and what it means, and you both traced a lot of authoritarian abuses of power.
Yeah, so there's no question, I think, that Périès's manuscript can be read along the grain as a broad critique of slave revolt, of the policies of emancipation that the French Republic pursued in 1794, and of the capacity of people of African descent to function in a kind of age of democratic revolutions, to self-govern, in effect. So I think that's basically true, right? So read along the grain, Périès does present this kind of emerging critique of the mistakes that he perceives that the French revolutionary governments made. On the other hand, and Manuel's kind of section of the paper pointed this out, if you sort of read it against the grain, what emerges is a kind of counter-narrative of Black radicalism and, in fact, Black power and leadership. So just to give one example that Manuel alluded to a little bit in his part of the talk, there's a section in the manuscript in which Périès discusses a group of people that he identifies as Congos. So presumably these are people who had once been enslaved and who have been part of the insurgency and so on and so forth. And they have kind of cut some sort of deal, in effect, to provision more or less the French Expeditionary Army with coffee, among other things. And the entire section, on one level, reads as a critique of the French generals who sort of behave really immorally and so forth in their relationship to these Congos, who again are bringing all of these provisions to the army. Read another way, however, it is this really potent example of the capacity of formerly enslaved people in Saint-Domingue to govern themselves, to participate in markets, to engage in really complex economic activity, to occasionally pull one over on the French Expeditionary Army. So I think the counter-narrative element of Périès's manuscript does kind of present this really interesting narrative in which the kind of age of democratic revolutions actually exists at its most radical.
Adding to that, what we see also through this narrative is, the Haitian Revolution, where there were, it's a multi-layered and very complex event in the same way as the American or the French Revolution. And there are different revolutions happening at the same time. And you see, a bit all of that, behind these lines. On the one hand, there's the revolution with the leaders, led by Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines. But there's also the revolutionary from below, described by Caroline Fick, and the tensions between these different revolutions is present in the text. So you see it, although it's not the lessons that Périès draws from what he observes, but his observation are actually showing that tension within the Haitian Revolution.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. I was wondering, do you think that the author intended the manuscript to be published? Did he want it to be published in his lifetime? Obviously, the scandalous comments about the French generals would have put him in quite some peril, I would imagine. But what do you think his intent was? And What it could have been published before.
So it's clear that he wanted to publish it. There are references to it in how he established footnotes, and he talks a little bit about the publication. So it didn't, and also what's interesting is it's a criticism of Bonaparte, but the way he does it is to avoid overt criticism, because he knew that it would be complicated to publish if it was too, directly an attack on Bonaparte. So that's clear that it was his goal, and it's part of, Chris was mentioning that it was a jack of all trades. The idea was you don't make money in any other way. So we found him in the French archives a lot, trying to get concessions and getting some advantages. He tries everything, and like many others at this time, this is the time of with the French Revolution, explosion of publications, and some imagine that it's a way to make money. And if you go to Saint-Domingue, still that's still true, and that's very true in 1802. People want to get the money that they thought they were deprived of by the revolution. So he's one of these individuals.
Thanks for that fascinating talk. So I had two questions. The first one kind of, I think, builds on the last one, which is, I find what's really fascinating is how this is a sort of compendium of viewpoints and sources with footnotes, and how normal was that sort of compendium style for the time? Is he like groundbreaking in producing a kind of one-man archive from all of these different sources? So I wonder if you could contextualize it a bit in that respect. And then secondly, how are you publishing it? How can we read it? What are you planning to do to circulate this publication?
Sure. Thanks, Emma. So to the question of how kind of representative Périès is in his kind of bricolage approach to the manuscript, there are quite a number of other manuscripts specifically from this period that do very much the same thing. And they do so in a kind of historiographical way that we would all kind of recognizing. They're looking for points of evidence that they can use to really cement the particular case that they're making. And it's all the more important, I think, for Périès to do it, and for other people to do it in 1802, 1803, 1804, because they're attempting to explain one of the most kind of radical and public and costly ostensible failures of administration, of the French military, you name it, of the entire revolutionary period. And so he's looking for, I think, and so are other authors, they're looking for documentation to show that they themselves are the honest man and the other folks have been kind of bogus. So no, I don't think it's especially innovative or anything like that. I will say that, like I mentioned, there's many Jacques Périèses, and one of the things that he is a spy. So he is spying on behalf of the French Ministry of the Navy on the people that he works with. And we suspect pretty strongly that he gets access discreetly to all sorts of things. So, correspondence potentially, printed material that's proliferating, et cetera, et cetera. And so he's somewhat unusual in the level of access I think he has, or we think he has, to administrative information. But as far as the kind of cobbled together framework of the document itself, I don't think it's especially innovative.
And to make sense of that, if how the Haitian Revolution was constantly discussed in the metropole. It was always competing interpretation of what was happening. So there's always, because the idea, the news coming 50 days after the event created space for this kind of confrontation, and always building different competing narratives. They were constantly competing narratives. So it's part of that moment when he knew from the outset that he would have to provide, a different narrative than the one that is provided by the military. So I think that's quite the mood of it. And I mean, what makes it more unique than what exists with some of the other examples that exist at the time was, the sources that he used show that he actually might have taken some of the documents for himself. So, and I'm pretty sure that some of the conversation maybe transformed a little bit of the conversation himself, but he's someone who journals, who keeps diaries. And so that's one reason, because he has this ultimate idea in the end.
And the second part of Emma's question.
Could you repeat the second question? I'm sorry, I'm aging before our very eyes. Sorry. First thing to go, short-term memory. So the book is under contract with the Omohundro Institute, and so as a result, that's where it'll be published, and we're publishing it as carefully and conscientiously as we can. Like Manuel said, the work of translation was a lot of work. The way we did it was that I took a first pass at the 60,000 words, and then we would meet for 2 or 3 hours a week forever to go over that translation and kind of, debate and correct and so on and so forth. And we're very hopeful that it can contribute and so on, but we're also very hopeful that we can remain faithful to the strangeness of the text. It was speaking only for myself, it's a very difficult job of translation, lots of rococo sentences, far more semicolons than should exist in a manuscript. And so that work was really, I think, difficult, but also tremendously, in the end, revealing. Manuel is exactly right. The process of translation was not just a kind of, administrative function. It was actual, I really do believe it was intellectual work. And there were elements of the manuscript that only sort of revealed themselves to us in that process.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I'm not sure that I can make this question coherent, because there are, like with the project that you've described, there's so many layers that are overlapping here. This is such a meta project and such a meta manuscript, right? But I think what's so great, and I'm going to try to shape this in the form of a question, but I think what's so terrific about this presentation as our opening is that it lets us work across the so many different ways that we use the term archive. We use archive to talk about like an object. We use it to talk about a collection of materials that are casually brought together. We talk about the buildings, literally the physical spaces where a collection is housed, an institution which may or may not have a set of archival collections or a building. Anyway, there's just so many different ways. So here you have this object that is itself an archive of other objects. And it has been housed in one of the most storied Western archival institutions. And at every layer and level, it is reflecting colonialism, which I suppose is one of the main arguments of critical archive studies, that archival constitution in the Western context comes out of colonialism and the documentation and the drive for creating authority out of documentation. So I found myself wondering, wishing that I could see the cataloging record at the British Library for this object. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your sense of the relationship between the object, the manuscript, and the archive that it comprises, like the documents that it includes, and its situation in this institution, this archive. Like, how does it sit in a whole set of other materials?
Let me just start.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, so what explains why this document has been so much, has been ignored in this way for so long was the location. The British Library is not the place where you usually go to do the history of the Haitian Revolution. And this isolation, they're not, to my knowledge, they're not a ton of documents at the British Library, unlike the National Archives at Kew, because Saint-Domingue was partly occupied from 1793 to 1798. So there have been scholars who actually use these archives. This isolation played a role. And I will give another example and that's part to the point that Chris made at the beginning of the introduction, saying that the scattered aspect of the archives of the Haitian Revolution. And you can find them, but it shows also its global significance in other ways, because for my work, I found really important collection of archives in the Detroit Public Library. In French, documents that were almost never consulted. I mean, the last time they were consulted when I consulted them was in the 1970s. And it was really, and that's actually telling something about what you said, the colonialism and the experience of talking about the Haitian Revolution, the isolated documents everywhere, and what is our role as historians in connecting these documents and creating a narrative around those documents.
That's a tremendous answer. The only thing I'll add is that in a funny way, we shouldn't have been the people to do this. There's a very, very well-regarded French colonial historian from the kind of mid to late 20th century, Gabriel Debien, who helped publish some of Périèz's snitch correspondence, so he knew about those letters and so on, and that's why we have those. And I was actually so curious as to why he had not pursued this manuscript that I went to the departmental archive in Bordeaux and looked at his papers and saw his personal notes where he actually did look at the document and didn't do anything with it. Which I had the same reaction. So thank you on one level, but why on the other? And I do think this does speak to the kind of, and it's inherent in our field, the kind of compartmentalization of national archives and imperial archives when the processes of creating the documents that fill those archives are fundamentally transnational and transimperial. And it's always been somewhat difficult to sort of undo that set of distinctions that have been made artificially by those kind of national archives and libraries.
Okay, now we have a question from our remote audience. It's from Susan Valadares, and it's a manifold question, I must say. Thank you for this fascinating paper. It was great to get glimpses of the manuscript itself and to understand it better in material terms. What did your engagement with the text as object suggest to you about its composition history? You've mentioned likely access to sources. Did it give you a sense of how long it may have taken to pen the work? I was intrigued by the shift you registered in part 2 of the manuscript. Does Perrier oscillate between genres, history, memoir, essay, report, in ways that you find especially interesting about this sense of authorial agency?
Thank you, and I'll try to, it was a little difficult to hear, sorry, the acoustics in here are a little tricky. So part of the question, I think, was about authorial, kind of authority and so forth, and the kind of cobbling together of the manuscript, and our sense of the manuscript kind of as object. Is that roughly right? Okay. So, we don't have, in some respects, we don't have a great sense of his process, in part because it's difficult to follow his timing. So we know that he flees Saint-Domingue sometime in 1803 aboard the Georgian Ophelia, winds up first in Havana and then in the Bahamas. It's our suspicion, it's a fairly strong suspicion, that he is a mobile archive, that he takes a great many of these manuscripts that he's absconded with him to complete the manuscript sometime in 1804 in exile in the Bahamas. So he himself is a really interesting example of someone sort of building an archive and declaring it authoritative, right? So he's trying to make this really powerful case that he thinks is probably going to make him money or get him esteem, that in fact, the loss of Saint-Domingue was the fault of amoral French military men, bad strategy, you name it, right? So our sense, I think, is that he is personally kind of constructing this archive for his own purposes, and in part for his own self-aggrandizement and profit.
And then there's another
So, hi. I'm actually going to ask a question about the connection between this work and here in Providence. Just a mile and a half north of here is Rochambeau Avenue and Camp Street. So for us, the revolution is right here, right? So when you're talking about the revolution, it's understanding, hopefully we'll get to the point where we make a connection between what was happening in Haiti and then how Rochambeau actually got here and involved in our revolution and how that is archived. So I would hope you'd answer that.
So it's kind of about the Rochambeau family, basically.
Yeah,
So
you should know that Rochambeau, there in Providence, there's Rochambeau Community Library, there's Rochambeau Street, downtown, everywhere. Right, exactly, yeah. So that it's a father and son situation, right? That you can maybe talk more about.
Yeah. And so we're talking about the family. So it's part of the family of the Rochambeau of his father. So was there for during the American Revolution. So this is the family of Rochambeau. And it's interesting. I think you raised a good question that, these histories are generally disconnected. The history of Saint-Domingue on the one hand, and the history of the American Revolution on the other. In that regard, that these are very. Rochambeau is regarded as the worst criminal of the Haitian Revolution, among many others. He's been, and on the other hand, the status of a hero that still Rochambeau occupies. So this is a good question. Yes.
Thank you for this. I wanted to come back to a point that you raised in the talk about translation as itself an act of scholarship and as intellectually generative for thinking about how to interpret the source. Partly to give you a chance to expand on that, and in particular along the vein of thinking about collaborative scholarship, which is also something that we as a field are still not very good at. And then second, to ask if you have advice for those of us with the misfortune to research and write and teach and publish in the same language as the sources that we work with.
Yeah, to the second question, you're on your own. I do occasionally use English language sources when I have. No, it's all fine. So first to kind of collaborative scholarship. I have known Manuel for some time. I was in Paris when he was a graduate student. And we both, we think, encountered this manuscript in 2016 in the British Library. I'm going to cede to Manuel and the French. I think they planted the flag first. I think I saw the manuscript a few weeks after he did. My encounter with the manuscript was one of the great joys of my archival career, in part because the Haitian Revolution is tremendously hard on documents. And so we have this, like we mentioned in the talk, there's a kind of corpus of first-person accounts and accounts published later and so forth. We kind of know what they are. And so I just called this document up in the British Library, not paying a ton of attention to it and assuming it was just one of the accounts I already knew. And within a couple of pages, I realized that that wasn't the case. And so it being somewhat late in the afternoon and morning in the United States, I started texting friends and colleagues, like, I'm looking at this thing, do you know what this is? And got a lot of no's from the people who should have known. So that's when I kind of figured out on my end that we had kind of stumbled across something new and interesting. And I knew from the very get-go, on my end, that there was no way that I myself was going to be able to do the work of translating this document into English alone. I'm an okay French speaker and all that other stuff, but the kind of complexity of the writing, the really quite Baroque nature of the prose, the sentence structure, the references and so forth, I knew immediately that it was going to demand a native French speaker. And I will say that I had a conversation about it with one of my American colleagues, and he said, you know who would be perfect is Manuel Covo. And then we happened to find out later that we had seen the same manuscript. So that's sort of what the encounter with the text was like. The work of translation being intellectual activity. First of all, it's tremendously difficult. I expended way more brain power than I have kind of doing the initial pass at the translation. And then, like I said, we would get on Zoom once a week for 2 or 3 hours and go sentence by sentence, line by line through the text. And the initial pass at the translation, I was far less interested in the documents that had been kind of grafted onto the manuscript, because I was sort of in robot mode and trying to get the language right and so forth. And those elements of the manuscript, the kind of bricolage, his assembly of the colonial archive, became way more interesting to us and meaningful to us during the process of translation. And I don't know that I would necessarily have gotten there had we not done the kind of painstaking work of going line by line together through the manuscript.
Yes, I would like to add to that. You know, in the same way, I would never have been able to do it by myself, but the collaboration itself was extremely fruitful because, you know, sometimes we spend 2 hours on one sentence because there were so many ways to interpret some of the words, and the discussion was necessary. I think it's unfortunate that sometimes, especially in the United States, the collaborative aspect is not necessarily a normal way of conducting research. In this, it's really, you know, a partnership. But, you know, for instance, the question of translation, you know, there's this word habitant, which is common in Saint-Domingue, and in general, it means planter. But it can also mean resident, and it can also mean colonist. And the question was, do we keep always the same translation for that word? Do we want to stay coherent? Do we want to keep the original word all the time? But then, you know, the problem is there were so many French words that it would not be a translation anymore. Or do we want to change according to context? And that's why the interpretation is important, because there's no equivalent in English for that word. And that led us, and we changed our mind also. And we forgot what we talked about 18 months earlier. So we had then to review again our work. But that's the kind of, and that is not just quote unquote language, it's a question of how to understand the society that we actually discuss and the political stakes of the language that was used.
Well, it is 6 o'clock, so I think we're at the end, so please join me in thanking Manuel and